Great, I think we should kick things off. So welcome everyone. Please keep yourself on mute during the first start of this session while we have presentations. Throughout the session, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And at the end, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask questions as well. To our wonderful presenters that we have today. So we have Shaun Beaney from the Institute of Chartered Accountants for England and Wales, and also Katherine Gilroy from Seedrs. And I'm Charlotte Thompson. I'm Digital Economy Lead at KTN. And at KTN, we connect organisations to take your ideas to market, particularly in emerging markets. And in this case, I'm really proud to present Immersive UK for those of you working in the immersive space or interested in applying immersive technologies to your business. So I'd just quite like to start to tell you a little bit about Immersive UK before moving on to Shaun to talk about the funding and finance landscape and how crowdfunding fits within that. And then we'll be hearing from Katherine about actually what's good and bad about a crowdfunding campaign and when you should use it. So please feel free throughout the session to introduce yourself on the chat. So I've just popped on the chat now a little bit about myself and my LinkedIn. So please feel free to connect. But do feel free to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about why you're here today. That'd be wonderful. So Immersive UK. So we are a connected space for those that are interested in working within the immersive sector. We want to help you grow your business and make the connections across industry, academia and funders to realise your ambitions. So we are a membership organisation. It's a little bit different than perhaps some of our other innovation networks that you might have seen at KTN, but in doing so, we can add a lot more added value. It's a great place for you to be able to showcase the projects and organisations that you are working with, connect with other people across the UK and globally, hear about what other people are doing in this space, and also promote things like jobs and vacancies that you have available in your organisations to attract talent into your business. We provide a dedicated newsletter, and that includes all the funding and events in the space. So I don't know about you, but when you're trying to find what funding is suitable for your company and trawling lots of different websites and such things, well, why not just sign up and actually have a monthly digest of what things might be suitable for you? So it's great that you've joined. It means that you've heard about our events already, but we do run lots of members and wider innovation network events that I hope you will be able to join the rest of things that we get on with. And I just want to highlight one thing that is we announced yesterday through our newsletter, which is the investment report on the immersive landscape, which features companies that have already raised in this space and are the ones to watch. I think this is a great way of understanding how people have grown their companies through accessing funding and the types of funding that they have been able to obtain to get to the next milestone in the business. And Shaun has very kindly just put a link to that report in the chat. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Shaun to give us that overview of the funding landscape. Over to you, Shaun.
Hi, good morning. I should say good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Charlotte. I'm the warm-up act today to our star, Katherine Gilroy, who's the expert in crowdfunding. And it's partly in my capacity. I chair the Access to Finance group of Immersive UK, and we find as many ways as we can to encourage more investment and funding for all things immersive, and particularly for entrepreneurial and innovative companies. And Katherine's a member of that working group, and Charlotte's obviously one of the key members of the Immersive UK team. So I'm going to talk very briefly just about the sort of funding context for crowdfunding, A few ideas for doing your own research if you're looking for investment and funding, and for further info before we get into the real detail with Katherine about crowdfunding. The reason I'm doing this is because I work with a lot of organizations, the list shown here, around the questions of investing in startups and scale-up businesses, in innovation, and in the creative industries. And of course, in this context, I'm going to say that my favorite people to work with are Immersive UK and the team there, of course. And these are some things I've published on the subject. I've researched and written. These are all freely available online, but from quite a wide range of things, including the creative industries and even something recently on AI. And there's a good link there if we talk about what's actually getting people excited. Charlotte's just mentioned the report that I co-authored with Charlotte and with Asher Easton and with Dave Haynes. And we just published it yesterday afternoon. So hopefully you'll find that very informative. We've featured 10 main companies in there, including Anything World and Love Shark that you can see here. And then 21 other companies that are sort of bubbling under in terms of growth and investment. So that's all with the intention of it being a really useful resource for all of you in terms of getting ideas and learning about what other people have done very effectively. And it's not just a startup and early stage market. Just a couple of weeks ago, Snap, the owner of Snapchat, bought the British company Wave Optics, who were going to be in our report, but now been acquired for $500 million. So there's quite a lot going on. In terms of the overall investment picture, this just shows you total funding, which is the blue bars, of rounds of between £100,000 and £10 million, quite a range, but that's the kind of early stage and scale up market. And the yellow line shows you the number of deals. And the good news here is that we've got a very strong upward trend over the last decade. Yes, it flattens out, but not that much, and not as much as I expected during the COVID-19 crisis. I think those numbers will probably remain fairly flattish this year, 2021. But then I'll make a big prediction here and say that I think that the graph will continue to go upwards after that. So there is a lot of funding. This is just the UK picture. And you know, these are some of the things that, in my view, are getting people particularly excited in innovation and getting investors excited. Quite a range, everything, you know, health and medicine very much at the forefront at the moment, but even things around zero carbon, anything to do with communications, infrastructure and transport is of great interest. And I think as well, the overlap between things like the creative industries and education and culture are very exciting. So if you're doing something connected with any of these, I think you're in a particularly good place. And on that score, the UK is a great place to do business and start up a business. The UK is always ranking 1 or 2 against New York as a global financial center. It's always very highly rated as a creative country. And as you can see here, also for tech VC, yes, it is dominated by London, but the report we published does show that there are great ventures right across the UK, and the report includes companies that are in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the English regions. And I just put this together last night. This is from Bowhurst. It's just a table of some of the amounts of fundraising over the past week. Great variety, some very intriguing companies always whenever I produce this list, just from a week. And I've highlighted their Igloo vision, which appears in the report that we've written, and just raised another £2 million. So good news for Immersive. Now, I'm not going to go through all these categories, but it's just really to say, when you start your journey for potentially looking for external funding or even business support, it really pays to do a lot of research and understand the kinds of business support available, crowdfunding, which we'll talk about, but also types of grants and things like startup loans. And in fact, I've highlighted there, Innovate UK has a new creative industries fund that is well worth looking at. That's giving grants of upwards of £25,000. So very useful when you're at an early stage of your business. And do also familiarize yourself with the Enterprise Investment Scheme, Seed EIS and EIS. There's lots of free information available online about those schemes, but they're very, very useful because they give big tax breaks to people who invest in startups and early stage companies, including through crowdfunding. So again, I'm not going to explain those today, but they're well worth learning more about. We've got a very active scene in the UK. There are more than 23 business angel networks. Bowhurst happens to have picked the sort of most active ones, but there could be anything up to 60. Nesta reckons there are anything up to 370 incubators and accelerators, and we've kind of lost count of how many VCs are active in the UK. I've tried to find a formal figure. I think it's probably in the region of about 100 who are genuinely active in the UK, and probably about 20 or 25 that are extremely active. So that's more good news. Now, one of the very important things, as I lead into Katherine's discussion here, is just understanding that there are very different forms of crowdfunding. They're very distinct from each other, and then of course the different platforms each have different business models. They have different fee structures. They have different minimum requirements and requirements for disclosure. So again, please do your research and find out. We're all familiar with charity crowdfunding. I'm sure that you've either donated to people doing charitable activities and climbing mountains and running marathons and those kind of things. And in fact, many of you may have utilized these platforms to raise money. So that's a sort of very established thing. There's then reward crowdfunding. So there's things like Indiegogo and Kickstarter in particular. That's where you're using crowdfunding to fund a creative or innovative idea. It could be anything from your first album to the creative industries, to inventions that have attracted funding, or a more mainstream business startup. But the purpose of reward crowdfunding is that if I invest in your business, if I commit through reward crowdfunding, I'm not expecting a financial return. I'm doing it almost as a philanthropic gesture. And maybe the reward might be that you invite me to the private view for the gallery that you open, or I'm allowed to beta test the video game that you've devised. It's a non-financial reward that I'll get for supporting your project. And it's been, these platforms have been fantastic for that kind of thing. The strange symbol at the bottom there is Patreon, which again is a different sort of business model, but it is used by many different creative people, even stand-up comedians for funding what they're doing. It's a slightly different model to the others. Again, well worth doing some research. And there, Katherine's going to talk about equity crowdfunding very shortly, including Seedrs. And again, the market in the UK is dominated by Seedrs and Crowdcube, but there are other business models. Syndicate Room is one I've just picked on there. I'm not on commission, by the way, but I've just picked on Syndicate Room because it has a kind of quasi crowdfunding and angel investment models, just showing the variety. And some people also include peer-to-peer lending in this family of crowdfunding, but effectively things like Funding Circle are now operating like online banks. So that's also worth looking into. And finally, from me, here are some free sources of very reputable information. Some of them I've been involved into. So again, do your research and please do utilize these different resources, including Immersive UK, when you want to find out about funding. And at that point, I'll hand over to the star of the show and our expert, Katherine Gilroy, to talk in depth now about crowdfunding. So thank you.
Thank you, Shaun, for that brilliant introduction. I'm just going to share my screen if you want to bear with me one moment. Hopefully you can see that now. But great, yeah, and thanks everyone for joining today. I know it's an absolutely glorious day outside, so I really appreciate you guys giving up an hour or giving up your lunch break to learn a little bit more about equity crowdfunding. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a much better awareness as to if equity crowdfunding is the right route for your business, what you need to start thinking about, and kind of practically how you would go about it. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some questions. So please do either pop them in the chat or kind of save them up for the end, and I'll be really happy to answer any questions you might have about anything we touch on in this presentation, or that you just want to kind of get a bit more information on. I'd like this to be as interactive as possible, so please do share any questions. I just wanted to touch really on kind of why equity crowdfunding as an industry or as a route to funding exists in the first place. If you kind of cast your mind back to 2008, I don't think we all like to put that behind us, but it's worth acknowledging that there was the financial crash, which meant that the banks were very reluctant to lend, and particularly into early stage high risk businesses. And so that kind of as an option for funding became much more limited. I think the statistic is still up to date, but if you think about all the kind of entrepreneurs out there, only 1% of founders actually raise funds through venture capital funding, so through institutional investment, which means that potentially there are 99% of all businesses out there who need to find other routes to funding. And so equity crowdfunding as an industry was created as a way of providing an alternative way to access capital, but also as a way to democratize private investment. Equity crowdfunding is about opening up the pool of investors in terms of who can invest in businesses, but also making sure that as many founders from as many backgrounds as possible are also able to access capital. So we're trying to kind of leave the days of the old boys clubs behind, and make sure that we're being as open and inclusive, and funding as many businesses and ventures as we possibly can. So for those that might not be so familiar with Seedrs, it's just a really quick overview of who we are. The official line is that we're Europe's leading equity crowdfunding platform. Essentially what that means is we are a marketplace for investing in high growth startups and scale-ups. We allow businesses to raise investment from a crowd of investors rather than just kind of one or two angels or institutional funds. And we allow absolutely anybody to be an investor. Usually the kind of lowest investment amount on our platform is £10, which means that it's super accessible. The barrier to investment is really low, and we want to get as many people involved in early stage investing as we can. We are a pan-European platform, so we raise for businesses throughout the EU, and that also means that we can accept investment from investors throughout the EU as well. We're sector agnostic, so we can raise for almost any kind of business, and you'll see there we've got everything from kind of travel to fashion to food and bev to gaming. I'd love it if we could have immersive technology as a sector there, and we'll talk a little bit later on about kind of investment in this space and how equity crowdfunding has been used and could be used much more going forward. And as a platform, we've had a good bit of success so far. So we've had £1.2 billion worth of investment that's been raised through the platform to date. That's been in almost 1,400 investment rounds. We've raised for businesses across over 21 European countries, and we currently have an industry-leading success rate of 85%. I think we're actually tracking slightly higher than that. So despite everything that's happened over the past kind of 12, 15, 18 months, the investment landscape actually through equity crowdfunding platforms is actually looking pretty positive. It's all about making sure that you get the mechanics of the round right, and that's what I'll talk you through in today's presentation. Here's just a selection of some of the businesses that we've raised for in the past, some of them that you might know, the likes of Revolut, Anamoney, Allplants. But we also have a real strength in terms of raising for early stage businesses as well. And again, we'll touch on that in just a moment. But just to start with, I guess a relatively simple question, but why do businesses think about equity crowdfunding? And it's worth mentioning that not every business is suitable for equity crowdfunding. And one of the real key decisions before you decide to push ahead with this is figuring out if this is the right route for you. And hopefully that will become clear as we talk through this. But typically businesses want to raise money through equity crowdfunding for a combination of these reasons. So the first one seems quite obvious. money. Lots of, I think one of the most common things that early stage startups want to talk to any advisor about is access to capital. It's often the biggest blocker in terms of being able to develop your technology, put your business out in front of potential customers and users, and really kind of have explosive and quick growth rather than perhaps more organic growth that you'd get without external investment. I mentioned before some of the challenges out there in terms of access to capital. If you raise money through an equity crowdfunding platform, you have a pool of investors who are signed up to the platform who are actively looking for exciting and early stage investment opportunities they can get involved in that they perhaps wouldn't otherwise get access to. The second one is validation, which might seem like quite a strange thing to say, but actually, if you think about it, crowdfunding is a really public way of raising money. And so if it goes well, what better validation for your business than if you have hundreds or potentially thousands of backers who've come in and they want to share in the success of your business. So you can really use that public platform as a way to validate your business. And that's particularly important for the earlier stage businesses that we work with. I'll touch on this in a little bit more detail later on, but on our platform, we work with businesses all the way from kind of pre-seed or seed all the way through to kind of Series B, Series C, Series D. So there's a real range of businesses that we work with, but validation is particularly important for those that are right at the start of their journey, and it can help you as you kind of try to hit further milestones as the business goes, that you have this crowd and this community of people that have chosen to back you at such an early stage. Which brings me on to the next point, which is community engagement. It's for this reason that quite often, if you look at equity platforms, you'll see that the majority, although not all, the majority of businesses on these kind of platforms are either B2C or B2B2C. This is because businesses that have a community have a pool of people who already love what that brand is doing, what that business is doing. And it's a really brilliant way to reward the people who are backing you from an early stage by giving them the opportunity to actually be part of the journey by owning shares in the business, and then hopefully sharing in the success as the business grows. This is quite often one of the main drivers for why some of the later stage businesses will raise with a platform like ours. Perhaps they don't necessarily need to use the crowd in order to access the money. They will have other sources available to them, but what they want is the community engagement. The reason for that is that if somebody owns a part of the business, then they hopefully become much more engaged customers and users, but they become real brand advocates for the business. You essentially build out a community, a tribe of people who are totally committed to what you're doing because they're on the journey with you. And that can have so much value beyond just the cash that those people are bringing as well. So kind of linked point there is marketing. It's a really brilliant way to put your business out in front of thousands of people that you might not otherwise get access to. Again, this is really important for the early stage businesses that we work with, as well as the later stage businesses. If you're right at the start of your journey, exposure is everything. And it can be quite difficult figuring out your go-to-market strategy and how you're going to where you're going to put marketing budget behind things. If you run a crowdfunding campaign, A, you're hitting all of the eyes that are already on the platform, but B, you can quite often make a lot of noise, pick up some PR coverage, and hopefully kind of get some good news stories coming out of the fact that you're raising, through a crowdfunding platform, and then you can share all the other successes that you've had as a business so far. And the last point, which is more of a practical point, but it's just speed. Crowdfunding is not an easy way of raising funds, and again, we'll touch on this in a moment, but when you compare it to some of the other options out there, it can be a quicker way to raise funds. Typically on our platform, we say that from start to finish, so from you saying you want to push ahead with this to you having cash in the bank, you're looking at kind of like a 3 to 4 month process, which for equity fundraising is actually relatively quick. In my past life, I've spent 6 months working through due diligence alone before you even get to kind of sorting out transactional documents and getting money in the bank. So on that side of things, it can be a really great way to make sure that you get the money in the bank quickly and get back to doing what you want to be doing, which is running the business, and not to talk through today is a couple of myths around crowdfunding, so that this will hopefully help you focus in your mind as to whether crowdfunding is the right route for you. You have a total understanding as to what's involved, and then hopefully help you figure out if this is something you want to build into your fundraising plan. The first one that I come across quite often is this one. I'm either too early or I'm too late to use equity crowdfunding. I touched on this slightly earlier, but if I take the too early point to begin with, sometimes it can be more difficult for an early stage business to raise investment through a crowdfunding platform because you don't necessarily, or you don't usually have that community that I mentioned earlier. If you don't already have a group of people who are absolutely in love with your product or your services, then sometimes it can be difficult to think how you're going to engage some of those people in the early parts of your investment round. Really, on our platform, we're looking for businesses that are at post MVP stage, that have some form of traction. So you don't necessarily need to be revenue generating at this point. And I know this is something that comes up particularly with businesses that are working in the immersive technology space. Quite often the beginnings of the business, there's quite a lot of focus on R&D and kind of tech development, and kind of revenue is quite far down the line. You don't need to be revenue generating in order to raise funds through an equity crowdfunding platform. What you do need to have is some form of validation and some form of traction. So that might be if you've gone through a testing phase, if you've done surveys, if you've got people on some kind of freemium model before you move them onto a premium model later on. But as long as you have some kind of validation and some kind of traction within the market, then hopefully you should be good to go. You won't necessarily have a business community in the same way, but one of the things that you might be looking at then is a way to involve other people who already know and care about the business. So whether that be friends, family, people in the industry, and kind of other supporters of the brand. The next point in terms of I'm too late to use equity crowdfunding, again, there's a perception that sometimes if you're at the point where you're thinking about institutional investment or you're not a seed stage business, that crowdfunding isn't a route for you. And actually this kind of brings me on to my second point, which is businesses crowdfund because they can't raise from VCs or angels. These two things are connected. At the moment, I think that the statistic is about 60% of all investment rounds that are run through our platform are co-invested rounds, which means they are anchored by some form of institutional investor, VC, a family office, or a group of strategic angels. We have raised for lots of businesses that are VC backed. I think a couple of years ago, there was a perception that crowdfunding was a last resort, whereas actually the industry has completely developed. And now lots of businesses are choosing to raise funds when they do have options from elsewhere, but they're choosing to raise through crowdfunding platforms because they want the marketing, they want the exposure, and they want that community engagement that I mentioned before. So again, this is kind of for those businesses, particularly those that are B2C or B2B2C, if you have a group of consumers who ultimately your product or services lands in their hands, then it can be a really brilliant way to engage them, even if you are at the point of being able to raise funds from VCs. The crowd is dumb money. This is probably one of the most insulting myths that we get sometimes, but sometimes there is a perception of, why would I want to raise money from the crowd if I could get an angel investor on board, for example, who has industry experience and can open doors for me. I want a dragon kind of thing. And that is a really valid point. But it's worth mentioning that crowdfunding, equity crowdfunding, is just one of the tools that you have available to you when you're putting a round together. So one of the best ways actually to run an equity crowdfunding campaign is to lock in some strategic angels so that you get the benefits of those people, but then you also have the wider crowd. But actually, again, I'm going back to the community engagement point. If you manage to involve your customers and your users in a crowdfunding campaign so that they become totally invested in your business, they become true brand evangelists, well, I actually think that's very smart money. Your customers then become walking, talking recommenders for the business. They'll talk about you over the dinner table now that we're able to go out for dinner again. And actually that's really valuable. I mentioned before kind of the values beyond the capital. It's ongoing marketing for the business going forward. And so, yeah, say smart money rather than dumb. The next one is a practical point. Managing lots of small investors will be time consuming. The answer to that is yes or no. It depends which platform you use. You want to make sure, from my opinion, that you use a crowdfunding platform that uses a nominee structure, which means that from a practical level, you have one additional shareholder on your cap table, but you get the benefit of having hundreds or potentially thousands of individual investors and individual backers who are going to give you that word of mouth marketing and that community engagement. So actually, rather than having hundreds of people, hundreds of bits of paper to sign, you actually just have one, and it keeps your cap table much more tidy. It also means that as the business grows and you get towards an exit, for example, again, it's really easy for you to sort out the paperwork involved in an acquisition or whatever exit stage you're going through. The next one, businesses looking to raise from the crowd are overvalued. I think sometimes this is something that is thrown around. Actually, I think that the truth is the opposite of this. It's a very transparent way of raising funds. Your valuation is put up on a platform, and because we're a marketplace, investors essentially choose whether they want to accept that valuation or not. And so it's actually a really good validation as to whether you've got the right valuation in place. One of the biggest reasons that we see that crowdfunding campaigns don't fund is if they've got a super inflated valuation, at least on our platform. And so whilst there can be sometimes a perception that you can get away with a higher valuation on a crowdfunding platform, if the valuation is too high, then investors simply won't invest. One point that's also worth mentioning on this is that part of the reason why quite often we have rounds that are anchored by an institutional investor or a bunch of strategic angels, it's because those lead investors will essentially validate the price. So quite often you won't necessarily get away with a higher valuation because you will have had to have convinced other private offline investors that this is the right price for your business. And so again, this is one that perhaps isn't always correct. And then the last one, which I'm going to talk you through in a bit more detail now, is that crowdfunding is an easy way to get investment. Unfortunately, fundraising is not easy, whichever route you choose to go down. There are pluses and disadvantages for every route you choose to go through. I would love it if crowdfunding was a route where you could list on the platform and the money just falls in, but unfortunately, it doesn't quite work like that. As I'm sure some of you will know, it does involve work, and again, this is one of the biggest reasons why certain campaigns will fail, is if the founding team aren't engaged, and it has to be a real joint effort in terms of making sure that businesses are running their own fundraising efforts alongside the crowdfunding platform. It's not necessarily a case that it will all be funded through whichever platform you use. Which brings me quite nicely to this next point, which is how to successfully crowdfund. This is going to be relatively general advice, but again, if anybody has any specific questions, please do pop them in the chat as we go. But this is hopefully the easiest way to frame this in terms of thinking about how to put together a crowdfunding campaign. There are essentially three main elements. Each of them are equally important, and they're all linked, actually. They all feed into each other. The first is your private network. The second is your business community. And the third one is your Seedrs investors. And you need all three of those in order to get to 100% of your target. And as I just said, they all link into each other. So you kickstart the momentum in the round with your private investors. You then open the opportunity out to your business community, again, where you start to kickstart more momentum in the round. So that hopefully at the point that the round is opened out to the public and it's open to Seedrs investors, our investors will look at a campaign and think, I can't not get involved in this because look how popular it is, look how quickly it's going. This was one that I must pay attention to. So the step one is all about owning your private network. And I think one of the most common things that entrepreneurs say to me, and I work specifically with early stage founders, is that people tell me they don't know any investors. And I'm constantly telling people to unthink anything you think you know about who an investor is. Because when you're raising through a crowdfunding platform, an investor is actually anybody who you already know, who cares about you or your business, and has the ability to invest at least £10. And that's usually most people. So when you're thinking about putting a crowdfunding campaign together, the first thing that I always ask every business that I'm working with when we're strategizing around to do is to map out your own community, because you'll be really surprised about who you know and the people that know the people who you know. It's all about kind of figuring out what your network looks like, and then figuring out how to extend that network and tap into the other people that are around you. You'll always be pleasantly surprised. So you're going to start looking at friends, family, your professional network. LinkedIn is a brilliant place to kind of build a personal network, to expand it, to reach out to kind of people who are advertising themselves as early stage investors. There's lots of them out there that are quite often very happy to have a chat or to look at a pitch deck. So don't underestimate the power of LinkedIn. Friends of the business, so as I say, people who already know about the business. You can go to events, or you could. Now we're doing these all online, but again, it's an easier way to just give up an hour of your lunch break rather than kind of a whole evening, I suppose. So in some ways, these virtual events have been brilliant in terms of networking, in terms of investment. If you're lucky to know any angel investors or kind of any industry experts or strategic investors, then also kind of include those people, even if they're a couple of steps away from you, because chances are 6 degrees of separation, you'll hopefully be able to kind of get in touch with somebody. Or as I mentioned, there are a lot of investors out there now, particularly when we're thinking about kind of making sure that it's not the same kind of entrepreneurs who are raising funds if you're in a specific network. Lots of angel investors now are open to cold messages, cold emails, cold LinkedIn messages. So if they're advertising themselves as an investor, then chances are that they're open to have a chat. So the very first point, and one that's really important to make, particularly if you're early stage, is don't underestimate the power of your own network. That's going to be really important for laying the foundations for a crowdfunding campaign. We then move on to your business community. This is all about building a community, because community ultimately equals capital. And here's just a couple of examples of some of the businesses that we've worked with and how they've done this really well. So some businesses have built up a pre-launch feedback cycle, and this is kind of pre-launch for their product even, rather than launch of a crowdfunding campaign. So some businesses in the past have set up a private Facebook group, for example, where they have allowed people to beta test their products or their services. They've asked for feedback, so they then have a group of, even if it's relatively small, they have a group of essentially super users right there at the start who are involved in developing the business, and they're really part of the journey. Those people are your prime candidates for equity crowdfunding, because they're already invested in the success of the business, and then you're going to give them an opportunity to take part of it. The second route that is one of the most common routes is an email newsletter. If you're pre-launch, you can build up a wait list. If you've already launched, get as many people as you can on an email newsletter. I think sometimes people put a lot of emphasis on social media and don't always think about pulling people into a newsletter. Social media is great. It's really good for brand awareness and kind of creating noise. But where you'll get real brand loyalty is through an email newsletter, because if something's landing directly in someone's inbox, they're much more likely to pay attention to it, particularly if you have a particularly grabbing headline that means they actually open it, rather than just a post that you put on their Instagram, their Twitter, that they're just kind of scrolling through and then it's gone. So if you're thinking about planning for a crowdfunding campaign, I always say put emphasis on your newsletter. In the communications that you push out in your newsletter, I always suggest that even if you're not planning on raising for another kind of 6-12 months, you can start to warm your community up for a crowdfunding campaign without them realizing that's what you're doing. If you also talk to them about the business behind the brand, so kind of lifting the lid a little bit on the business, the journey, any key milestones, talking about the team. Again, effectively, if you push that messaging out, you're warming your community up for a crowdfunding campaign well in advance. I mean, we've seen lots of businesses do that really, really well. And then the final thing to mention is loyalty schemes and rewards. Again, this kind of depends on what your business is. But if you have a business that is a product-based business, or that is kind of a consumer service, then quite often you can offer perks and rewards and things that are really geared around engagement. I always say, think of money can't buy type experiences or perks that your customers really want. So put yourself in the shoes of your users and your customers, and you can offer rewards out on top of the equity that they're raising. So this is kind of blending equity crowdfunding with rewards-based crowdfunding. It's something that we're seeing become much more popular. And And it makes sense, both for your existing users, but also for new investors that you're putting the opportunity out to. Quite often they'll want to be able to see and feel your products or your services. And if they can do that in a way where they get a discount, for example, or they're invited into where they get to test new products or new services, then that's really attractive, and it offers perks kind of beyond the capital, which is a long-term incentive. If you give people something in the short term as well as an additional sweetener to the investment, then that can really help to engage those people and pull them into the round. And then the final thing to think about is appealing to your platform investors. So in our case, appealing to your Seedrs investors. A lot of the work that I do when I'm talking about strategy for a crowdfunding campaign is the narrative, and it's really important. Crowdfunding is all about the story, which I think is part of the reason why immersive technologies can be a really brilliant fit for equity crowdfunding, because there's such brilliant and powerful stories there. Particularly if you're going to run a campaign, you have the option to do a crowdfunding video, and you can show off all the really cool things that you're doing, particularly if you're working on some technology that perhaps people haven't necessarily come across before. It's a really brilliant way to showcase it and help people to really understand kind of the magic of what you're building. But when you're putting together your narrative for the campaign, these are the three things that I always say you should start to think about, or you want to make sure that you're covering off. Because if you think about who is on a crowdfunding platform, you have £10 investors on one end, all the way through to your more traditional angel investors on the other end. It's really difficult to speak to all investors in the same way, and you normally shouldn't do, but through a crowdfunding platform, you kind of have no choice. So you want to make sure that you're hitting all the things that those different kinds of people want to hear about. And I would say you want to hit the investors that are investing with their head, those that are investing with their heart, and those that are thinking about the little kid inside of them, so what's going to excite them for the future. The head is, have you got the numbers sorted? Have you are you really outlining your metrics? Does your valuation make sense? Is there a story of growth? Have you got, if you're not yet revenue generating, have you started to build up a pipeline? Can people see the kind of the business proposition? And do they want to get on board with it? Does it make sense? Are the numbers ambitious enough, but also not plucked out of the air? All of that kind of thing. The heart is the story. So as I mentioned, you have the opportunity to put together a video, more so than other types of funding. Sometimes the story is a big part of crowdfunding. Crowdfunding tends to lend itself to businesses that are mission-led, have some kind of impact behind what they're doing. And that's because you have a real platform to tell the story and to get people excited about what you're doing. And that kind of brings me on to the last point as well, which is the little kid inside of you. Every early stage investor, whether they're investing £10 or £10,000, wants to think that they're investing in the next, Spotify or whatever it might be. You want to get people excited about your opportunity and what the future might bring. And if you can hit head, heart, and excitement in your narrative, then that should be a recipe for success. And so that's a whistle-stop tour of crowdfunding. I've seen a couple of kind of comments coming in through the chat. So hopefully we can kind of cover off those questions now. But my contact details are there as well. I'm very happy to connect with anybody offline. So if anybody would like to talk about potentially putting a round together, even if this is something you're thinking about doing at some point in the future, then I'm always very happy to chat. But I guess now we can open out to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Katherine and Shaun, for your presentations. Super insightful. So we had a few questions already submitted through the application, and if you have any more, then please do put them on the chat. I wanted to kind of pick up on a point, actually, Katherine, that you made about reaching out to your friends and family, and that is it's Section 21 of the Financial Act that you can't just promote any investment to anyone. You have to know that they can afford to lose the money, or they know their capital is at risk. And so going through a regulated platform, is that a way of getting around that challenge?
Yeah, exactly. You have to be really careful with the rules around financial promotions, and that's essentially inciting or inducing somebody to invest in an early stage venture, because it is so high risk. And so there are lots of regulations that are in place. Seedrs as a platform is a regulated entity. We're regulated by the FCA, and we verify absolutely everything that we put out there in relation to an investment opportunity. So this is something that happens in the preparation process for a crowdfunding campaign. So it's worth mentioning that this sometimes can be a bit of a painful process. We go by line by line, anything that you put out, whether it's in your pitch, whether it's in your video, whether it's in any promotional material that you put out on social media or emails. And we verify absolutely everything that that a business will want to say about itself and about the investment opportunity. And this effectively, we give it the Seedrs stamp of approval, which means that you can then push that out wherever you like and push it out to the public without going through a regulated entity like us. You would run the risk of falling foul of those regulations, and the penalties can be quite severe on that. So it's always really important to make sure that you're sitting the right side of the regulations and that you're taking proper advice. But yes, if you use a platform like us, then essentially we kind of give you a green tick and you can go off and spread it, knowing that you've got the protection of our platform.
And Shaun, certainly that's, you know, from the crowdfunding perspective, you kind of sort of said how that kind of complemented with lots of other forms of funding. Do those sort of considerations need to be taken into account as well when approaching what might be an angel investor or VC?
Yeah, it's well worth thinking about how, if you're going to look at different kinds of funding, how they would fit together and to ensure that they complement each other. I think, you know, if you have, for example, if you have a significant private investor or two on board, they've got to be comfortable with the fact that you're going down the crowdfunding route. And equally, you know, if you're going to use a crowdfunding platform like Seedrs, make sure that you're using it effectively, not necessarily to reach a large number of investors. It may be just to access a few key people to support you. I think the most important thing, I think there's a lot of really valuable things that Katherine said there, and a lot of very sensible advice, not hype, but actually advice. I think one of the most important things that Katherine said was that not every business is suitable for crowdfunding. And actually, we flip it, not every crowdfunding platform is suitable for your business. So it's really worth doing your due diligence, as we like to say in the world of corporate finance, on the platforms. It's very important that when you choose a platform, as well as the specific technical requirements and the regulatory ones you mentioned, Charlotte, that you also think, is using that platform going to help to, as Katherine said, validate what we're doing? Is it going to enhance our reputation? Because there's a reputation risk if you use a platform and it's not effective, or there are problems that it creates. So does it help with the reputation? And most importantly of all, in all aspects of your business, does it increase trust between everyone who's involved in the business and investing in it? And obviously Seedrs is very reputable and well-established platform. There are some specialist ones as well, but it really pays to do your research and do your due diligence. Is the thing I'm going to bang on about today.
Yeah, I was thinking, if you look at it's so easy to look up online the cost of a house that you're looking to buy, because there's a rich history of data. And so if you can find data on companies that have raised before and their journey, then it's probably a good way of being able to kind of validate and show the possible funding journeys that would be appropriate for you. And you mentioned about validation, and Katherine, you talked in your talk about how you should really show some level of validation before going on to a crowdfunding campaign. But what I liked about what you said is that you don't have to have sales and revenue, but you do need to be able to show that there are customers willing to buy, and there's a lovely big market opportunity for that, and the different types associated with it. So for me, that was quite novel, because often we like to see sticky recurring revenues.
Yeah, absolutely. And to a degree, it's an easier conversation with investors if you do have that revenue, particularly if it is sticky and recurring. But it's not necessarily a prerequisite for raising with a platform like ours. You have to be, unfortunately, you can't be kind of an idea on a PowerPoint stage. The business needs to have moved on a little bit further from that. And sometimes that can be a bit of a challenge in terms of, with lots of entrepreneurs thinking, well, how do I get to that next stage? Because quite often the biggest blocker to being able to get kind of post MVP is that you need some funds to get off the ground. I think Shaun mentioned in his intro, there are kind of lots of accelerators and incubator programs out there which are really good. There are other routes to funding, there are grants, there are startup loans that are there for people who are right to that very, very early stage. But if you are at the point where you're thinking about raising equity and you're raising, I guess, a sensible amount of money at an early stage, then crowdfunding can be a good option if you can show that initial validation and that initial traction. I'm always asked kind of, what does traction mean? How much traction do you want to see? That's an impossible question to answer. Lots of investors, every investor will bang on about traction, but no one will give you anything specific. But it's totally dependent on your business, what sector you're in. Are you in a trending space? Does the founding team have any particular relevant experience? Do you have a network to engage in the round as well? All of those things help early stage businesses. But yeah, absolutely, you don't need to be revenue generating in order to raise.
Thank you.
I'll ask you a question, Katherine, which is just a quick one, which is obviously, as you said, people have often, I think they've usually raised some money or have some commitments from their own private networks. If they're lucky, it might be well-to-do friends and family or contacts or colleagues. Is there a sort of average proportion of the total, if they're going to go and try and raise £100,000 or £200,000, for example, is there a sort of typical level to which they would have already got private commitments before they then go public on Seedrs to raise the rest?
Yeah, absolutely. So every business that raises with us needs to have some form of, we call it, usually we'll say it's pre-committed investment rather than a lead investor, because as I say, the beauty of crowdfunding is that you don't necessarily, depending on how much you're looking to raise, you don't necessarily need to have a lead investor. You can pull together lots of kind of smaller or medium-sized tickets to get that lead investment or that pre-committed investment. It also is totally dependent on stage of business, what sector you're in. If you're in a really kind of trending space that we know that we have a lot of track record for, potentially you can launch with a lower percent committed. It's also worth mentioning, and I will give you a number in just a moment, I'm not delaying. It's worth mentioning that we always think in terms of two targets on a crowdfunding platform. So you always have a minimum investment target, which is the 100% that you see on the platform, and then businesses will have in mind a stretch goal. So that's quite often you'll see businesses that are at 150%, 200% funded, so they're in overfunding. When we're talking about the amount of money you want to have already locked in or committed upfront, you're always thinking about your minimum investment target. We don't have a hard and set criteria on this, but to be honest, we're not really putting businesses live at the moment unless they've got at least 50% of their minimum target already committed. The reason being for that is the way we want to structure around is that you kind of hit the platform in a really strong position, get to 100% as quickly as possible, and then use that initial boost of momentum to then drive on up in overfunding. There's a lot of kind of psychology of investment that goes into crowdfunding. We talk about fear of missing out quite a lot, actually, which sounds a bit flippant, but actually it's very important when you're thinking about crowdfunding. We always say that kind of no one wants to be the first one on the dance floor. If you can show that there are lots of investors that are already in the round, you'll be much more likely to get other people to say, oh, I want to take part too. Otherwise, you'll get people who say, this looks really cool and I really like what they're doing, but I'm going to sit back and watch what it does for a little while and then I'll come in later. So that's why having that pre-committed investment is really important. It's all about kickstarting the momentum before the wider public gets access to it. One point that's also worth mentioning is that before you go live in public, you have a private phase of the campaign as well. So that's when you have the opportunity to market your investment round to people who already know about the business. So you do have an opportunity to kind of push the crowdfund out rather than having to have everybody lined up before you press go. But you do need to be kind of in conversations with some of those larger ticket people in order to be able to push go on it.
So I'm sure you've put some really useful resources onto the chat for people to try and find out further information and kind of understand the right finance for them. You also presented in your presentation actually a variety of different crowdfunding types. Is there a database or resource available for where people could understand where the equivalent of Patron is, or the equivalent of Just Giving? Is there a bank of information out there?
Well, there's the Crowdfunding Association, which lists quite a few of the players. I mean, in equity crowdfunding, it's fair to say that in the UK it is dominated by Seedrs and Crowdcube, but there are some specialist players, and I think with reward crowdfunding, again, we tend to hear about Indiegogo and Kickstarter the most, but there are some niche places. I think it's useful to find specialist platforms, but you then need to be careful that they really have enough excitement and activity. Katherine talked about the child within. I think I can find mine. I'm 51, so it's hard work, but I think certainly that sense of excitement and enthusiasm is very important. So yeah, I think you can piece it together. I did put a list in the slides of resources where you would find that I think I put 6 or 7 links where you'll find, and I included in that the Crowdfunding Association. So if there's a way that people want to access those, that's a good place to start.
Brilliant, thank you.
I've just popped a link to, on the Seedrs platform, we have an academy, which is filled with a ton of free resources, which is really valuable. Some of it's to do with raising investments, some of it's to do with getting crowdfunding ready, but a lot of the rest of it is to do with building your business, building a brand, gaining that initial traction. We have some kind of on-demand webinars about grants and other kinds of funding as well. So it's well worth kind of going in there and having a play around, because there's lots of good and free stuff in there.
Fantastic. And we were chatting just before we went live with this event. You've recently closed a round for an immersive tech company. Do you want to tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one of the things when we were discussing putting this webinar together, I was saying that a slight frustration that I have is that across equity crowdfunding as a whole, there are not that many immersive technology businesses that have taken advantage of this as a tool to raise investment. And I'd love it if we could see some more coming through. But we have just closed a round for a business called Virtually Visiting, which is a kind of a travel business that has become much more relevant in recent times, I guess, as restrictions have been put in place. But essentially they do kind of tourism and travel experiences through VR. So I think they've had an uptick in interest, and hope that's going to grow even as the world does open up. It's a really brilliant way to help the world feel a little bit smaller. They raised a seed round with us. I think they raised about 280,000. They set out to raise 150 and overfunded quite significantly, which was really brilliant news for them. So yeah, I mean, I'll pop a link to that campaign so you can see what they did. But yeah, I'm always kind of open to talking to more immersive technology businesses. So if anybody on the line is thinking about raising funds, and hopefully you are, that's why you're here, do feel free to pop me an email or connect with me on LinkedIn.
You said, a seed round, kind of 100 and 150k in that instance. What's kind of the biggest you've kind of seen, not necessarily just in the immersive space, but generally as to the amount people can raise through the crowd?
Yeah, so there's a limit, which I think before businesses have to effectively put out prospectus. I think it's 8 million euros is the number. I might be wrong on that. But we have, I think the biggest round that we've done was about 10 million. But as I say, we kind of smallest end we can do is 50,000, and then yeah, we've got that kind of really kind of high level at the other end as well.
I would say, I mean, because I work for the Institute of Chartered Accountants and the corporate finance faculty, obviously if people are in the fortunate position where they're starting to look at raising millions of pounds, they should really get expert corporate finance advice to help them with that process, along with the expertise that they can tap at Seedrs, because it becomes, obviously a far more complex subject, and also one with regulatory issues that are very significant. So I think if you're getting up to that scale, then get corporate finance advice on what your options might be. So now I've said that, it means I can go back to my office and I'll be welcomed when the time comes.
Great. Well, thank you very much to Katherine and Shaun for your time today. We have run out of time. We will make this recording available. And if we have not answered any of your questions that you have asked, then please reach out to any of us and we will try and answer them, or at least find somebody who can. So thank you very much all for your time today. Yeah, wishing you all a wonderful day. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Charlotte.